Hello, how are you doing? Hope you had a chance to read some good books in the month of July. I had a really great reading month, although I didn't love all of these books. Some I had some quite mixed feelings about, and other ones weren't as successful for me, but a number of them really great, absolutely immersive reading experiences. So I want to talk about each of these books, including the first book I read since the long list announcement for this year's Booker Prize, which is Booth by Karen Joy Fowler, a really interesting and enjoyable historical novel about the family of John Wilkes Booth in the lead up to Lincoln's assassination, when he killed him shot him in a theater, and telling the family's story from a number of different points of view of different siblings in the family. There were many children in this family, although not all of them lived, and so it follows the different strands of their lives from their childhood and their tyrannical father. He was tyrannical in a lot of ways, though he's quite a complicated figure. He was a very prominent actor, and his family were very much living kind of in the shadow of that and in his legacy. And his sons, many of his sons, became actors, sort of following in his footsteps, and were carrying the Booth name of this famous Shakespearean actor. And because in some ways, like, he was a very gentle person. He was a vegetarian. He didn't believe in harming any life or any animals, but then at the same time he could be really awful and nasty to his family. His wife and his eldest daughter were very afraid of him, and he also had a first wife who he had sort of abandoned, even though she had a child, and so that enters into the story, the whole complication of that. And it's a strange thing. I only just finished reading this novel, so I feel like I'm still kind of making up my mind about it, although the immediate experience of it I found really interesting and enjoyable. Because there are so many historical details, some of which I knew, others I didn't know. Like, I didn't really know about the distinction between owning and leasing slaves before the American Civil War, and how there's this whole gray area of people who kind of justified using enforced labor through leasing slaves rather than owning them. And it's really interesting as well that there's also a kind of parallel story running of another family, of a black family that the Booths knew, who were trying to purchase their freedom over a period of many years. And this isn't like a prominent part of the novel, but it's kind of running in the background. And I really like how she interweaved their story in with the story of the Booths, which the author talks about in the afterword, how she felt really conflicted of writing about John Wilkes Booth, who she thought was, a bit of sort of arrogant person, attention seeker, and she felt very conflicted about giving him more attention to this assassin and this great like villain from U.S. history. And but to see the way that he developed over time and how he came to inhabit these extremist views, it is really interesting following that journey and the complicated dynamics of their family and how it leads up to that. And of course there's parallels between this and some recent bouts of extremism in America, when there's mass shootings of someone that takes it upon themselves to take this extreme action, and to mark themselves out in this historical and awful way, but also I think with the tensions in America over different political issues, which obviously during the American Civil War the country was absolutely divided, and you can see today that there are similar like political issues that really seriously divide the country in quite like a dangerous and severe way. And so looking at the parallels with that is really interesting too. But yeah, getting back to it being like a historical novel and all these little details that she writes about family life and ordinary life for people in that time. I mean, just the difficulty of traveling. Like, there's a really arduous journey to California, which is recounted like through Panama before there was like a proper railroad going through, and this arduous journey of going on foot. But also the way that family theaters worked in communities. There's a lot about acting and theater work and audiences and the whole interaction with that, which I found really interesting as well. And of course, when you have a historical figure that's being written about in a fictional context, you're just waiting to see like, oh, it's all building up to this one big moment, and it does do that. And so you're almost looking for any little sign of like, oh, this is an indication that he's going off the rails. And so there is a kind of difficulty, I think, with that, where there's just this absolute expectation of the reader that, because we know the historical facts and what he's going to do once in his life, and so yeah, I think that can sort of detract a little bit from the pleasure of the reading experience. But I did think that these characters and the family members that were portrayed were so interesting and diverse and had different shades to their characters, in that some they had some good actions, and then some of them acted a lot more selfishly and bad. There's a strain of alcoholism in the family, and yeah, following all those different aspects, as well as actually Lincoln's development. It follows the development of his life and his political career over the course of the novel, sort of in tandem with the Booth family. You see these like parallel stories running alongside, and like his sections are quite short as well, and much more matter of fact than that of the Booth family, where you can really see their emotional states. But it was interesting to see the development of his political career too, and how it was really only by chance that he was a sort of moderate in the right place at the right time that led him to being the presidential candidate and being the front runner, and being marked as this leader in history that really brought about this big change in the country. And there were slight parallels. So speaking of the Booker Prize, it's like interesting seeing slight parallels in storyline between this and George Saunders' novel, which previously won the Booker Prize, because it's mentioned in here the death of Willie, of Lincoln's son, and Lincoln and Mary's son, while he was president, and of course that was recounted in such like a fascinating and wild way in Lincoln in the Bardo. But yeah, I thought that was sort of an interesting little parallel that these stories, historical novels, sort of overlap in this way, and both being nominated for the Booker Prize. So yeah, I don't know if I would say it has a shot of winning this year's Booker Prize, but I think it has a good chance of making the shortlist, because I think it is a very well done historical novel. And then I'll briefly talk about two of the other two books that I happened to read before the long list announcement for the Booker Prize, which I had no idea that, I had a sort of inkling that maybe Glory might be listed for the prize, which really pushed me to read it. But yeah, I had no idea that Nightcrawling might be nominated for the prize. So I was really happy to read both of these, and so glad to see them listed for this prize, because yeah, they are really great. I mean, I've talked quite a lot about Glory because I was reading it towards the end of last month, and then I made a whole separate video about this. But it's so inventive, and I know some people have sort of criticized it that the use of the characters as animals, as to sort of satirize the coup in Zimbabwe in 2017 is a bit gimmicky, but I found it really effective. I think it works on a number of different levels. I mean, there's the immediate sort of comedic thing of these being animals and living and talking as humans, and there being quite like close parallels between personalities. Like overbearing tyrannical personalities are kind of like big scary animals, and then there are more meek characters or more like ordinary citizens that are kind of like lambs or goats, and so how she translates it in that way has this sort of like parallel with like the emotional reality of our world. But I think there's also like a poignancy to this. It's kind of like mythologizing these characters in this like larger story, and it's also allowing, I think, a kind of remove from our present day reality, since the events which are being fictionalized in this book are so in the recent past. I mean, it was just 5 years ago that a lot of these events occurred, and when listening to the author speak about this book, about how she started wanting to write a nonfiction book about the recent events in Zimbabwe, but how she felt a lot of other writers were doing that already, were doing that better. So what could she add to this? And so adding this device of characters as animals, and to sort of abstract these events from the immediate reality and recent times that we've lived through, I think is quite like an inventive and an interesting way of looking into these power dynamics in these political struggles for who will rule the country, and the way that ordinary citizens are being subjugated and held down. So yeah, I think this is a really great novel. And Nightcrawling, again, I made a whole other video about this, about how powerful I found it, and what an extraordinary book it is for an author that only just turned 20 years old last month. The writing is so poetic and powerful and precise, I think, and the way that she's structured the story and follows the psychology of her characters, of this young black woman that is forced into this very difficult situation in order to survive and to help her family and people that she loves survive, and then this situation that she's just forced into, where she's basically made into like a sex slave by the local police force, and just the atrociousness of that crime, and that could have happened like so recently in such recent times, and been because it is based on a real life historical incident, I just think is so shocking. And so that this book is raising awareness of that, and how we need to be vigilant about these things, I think is so powerful and so well done. But yeah, like I said, it's just such a well-written story. I think that it's extraordinary. Now, when I made my video about the Booker Prize long list, I forgot to do, like towards the end of it, the thing that I like to do of kind of doing a kind of crazy early prediction of like what might win the Booker Prize this year. And not to toot my own horn too much, but at last year when I made my long list video, at the end of that I said I sort of had a hunch that The Promise by Damon Galgut would win last year's prize, and it did. So I'll make another wild guess, and of course I can't know, as I've still have a lot more books on the long list to read. But if I was going to make a guess, I'd probably think that either Glory or Small Things Like These will win this year's prize. I just think these are both just such powerful novels. But if I had to pick one, because there can't be two winners, so we can't have that happen again, I would pick Glory to win this year's prize. So it'd be really interesting to see if that happens, and I'll be so happy if it does. But likewise, I mean, there are so many good books on this list, and I wouldn't count out Nightcrawling to win either, or even Booth. So yeah, it's I think it's going to be a close call and a tough race, and I may feel very differently when I've read more books from the long list. But I'd love to know if you have any early predictions, or just like for fun want to put in the comments the book that you think is going to win this year's prize, and then later in the year when the winner is actually announced, we can see who guessed it right, and who who won. So yeah, I also read Fight Night by Miriam Toews, which I did think had a chance of being listed for the prize this year, but and it wasn't. Unfortunately, no Canadians were listed for the prize this year. But yeah, this was such a good book, and a number of people recommended it to me, and it did take me a little bit to get into this book. I like started it once and then stopped and went back to it and restarted it, because I think the voice is like so or is quite like frenetic in a way of following this this girl's point of view who's been suspended from school. She's staying home with her mother and her grandmother, and her mother is very heavily pregnant and having difficulty finding work, acting, and also having some mental difficulties. And so her care mainly follows to her grandmother, who's a very charismatic and quirky individual and very strong-willed and opinionated, but also quite like fanciful and fun. And so she kind of handles her granddaughter's education, but then also I think the girl in this is educating her grandmother as much, and certainly helping to physically care for her, because the grandmother has a number of physical difficulties. And once I got into the voice of this and following her point of view and the dialogue between her and the grandmother and the mother and the whole dynamic of this family, as they have quite a few fights and are sort of like nipping and snapping at each other, but also there's a genuine love there. And so to follow that story and the real warmth and closeness of this family and this lineage of women that are relying on each other and educating and inspiring each other in many different ways, is really is a great experience. And yeah, so I just enjoyed reading this novel so much, and love how she played out the title of the use of fighting, and how these women are really at battle with elements in society which are they find quite like repressive, or battling things on an individual level with individuals that they have issues with, but also like battling within themselves of becoming the person that they want to be. And so she traces that struggle in a really complicated and interesting way by following their interactions with each other. And I would say that there's not like a huge strong like plot impetus to this story of like sort of pushing the story through. It's more just enjoying and reveling in the voices of the characters and their personalities, who are just so enjoyable to read about. They make lots of very like funny comments and observations, and but yeah, there's also lots of like bittersweet moments and lots of really emotional, you could feel the real like emotion underlying all the things that they say and do. And so yeah, a really great depiction of kind of sisterhood, but also interchanging roles of it's the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, but really their roles sort of switch and change over time, as we all do, in even though we might be sort of categorized in this way of I might be categorized as being a son and a brother and a husband, but really we inhabit lots of different roles in what we do. And I think the way that Miriam Toews shows that in how their days play out, and how and sometimes the daughter is sort of caring more for the mother, sometimes the grandmother is being the educator for the granddaughter, and but yeah, it's just so good. Yeah, and yeah, this still is the only second novel I've read by Miriam Toews. So I've also read her novel Women Talking, and I really want to read more of her work because yeah, she has a whole back catalogue that I want to explore. And then I also read Burntcoat by Sarah Hall. Finally got to this, though it was first published like towards the end of last year, and I enjoyed this book. I thought it was a solid, good book, recounting the story of a woman that becomes an artist and a affair she has with a man that and their connection with each other over this period of lockdown, when sort of plague that occurs, which is much more severe than the recent pandemic that we've experienced, but that was obviously inspired by the recent pandemic, and follows them like through lockdowns and illness and the whole drama surrounding that, but it's kind of amplified as a much more tense and terrifying situation. The pandemic was horrible, and a lot of people really suffered through it, but then I think a lot of us are aware that like things could have been a lot worse, and so Sarah Hall writes about such a situation. But there are a lot of interesting things in this novel, like about the development of her as an artist, also going through an abusive relationship before she gets in this relationship with a man who she's with over the course of this plague. She is in a horribly abusive relationship, and has a very tense, difficult relationship with her mother, who went through a lot of physical and mental difficulties, and so following that dynamic and how that changes while she's experiencing this horribly abusive relationship. It was an interesting story. I would say, though, that I never felt myself to be completely emotionally grabbed by this novel. I'm not sure what it is about Sarah Hall's writing. I've read a couple of other books by her where it never really like hits me in the heart, even though I know a lot of readers really respond to and connect with her writing. But for some reason, it just doesn't quite do that for me. Not sure why that is. It's probably more to do with me than Sarah Hall as a writer, or just like the combination of like my personality and the way that Sarah Hall writes. And I think maybe there's just a slight too much of like a polish to her prose that makes me feel slightly distanced from it. Or I'm really not sure what it is. I just, because like on the outside I would say this is a writer that I absolutely love, but yeah, there's just something about her writing which I just never entirely connect with. But if you think there's a book by Sarah Hall which is like her strongest and her most powerful that you would recommend I read, please do that, because I'm perfectly happy to read more of this author's work and to give her another chance. I also read the Country Girls trilogy by Edna O'Brien, with my wonderful friend Sarah from Hardcover Hearts, who the last time we did a buddy read was a couple of years ago, and then she said that she'd been wanting to read this, and it was on my summer reading list, and so we were like, yes, let's read this together, and I'm so happy I did, because this was published many years ago, and Edna O'Brien wrote it in the 60s, I believe. Is that correct? Yes, in the early 60s. And she, it is 3 different separate novels that she wrote over a course of, I think, like 6 years. They were published in quite rapid succession, and following the story of 2 girls growing up in rural Ireland. Obviously the country girls, but how they have very different personalities from each other. There's Kate and there's Baba, and following their story as they grow and develop and move out of their homes, go into a religious school, then and then leave that school under quite dramatic circumstances, and following them as they go to Dublin, start having relationships with men and working, and the whole journey of their development, and how, even though they are personalities quite different from each other, how they're kind of butting up against the conservative society in Ireland at that time, and also how the church, had such a big play in the community, and so they're kind of constantly struggling up against that, and following their journey was so wonderful and dramatic. And yeah, Kate, who's much more sensitive and thoughtful and in some ways quiet and reserved, and there's Baba, who's very brash and opinionated and says things which are purposefully controversial and has quite like a hard exterior. When Kate is in trouble, she doesn't really give her much emotional sympathy. But she does care for her, but in that way that people that are quite tough can sort of not show their feelings or be upfront and emotional the way that other people can. And this cycle of bad relationships that Kate gets into, and following that, there's lots of twists and turns in the story. So even though these novels were written and published a long time ago, it was so wonderful reading this alongside Sarah, because we were obviously discovering it together and the story, and because there are so many twists and turns in it that we could bounce off from each other and be like, oh, I can't believe that this happened, or that she said this, and we could connect with each other over the many funny lines and moments in this book. And there are many, there are so many good moments and very sly, funny observations that Edna O'Brien makes, but also lots of really emotional moments and tender moments. And so you get the full trajectory of these women's lives. Though I think we were agreed that we loved the first two books. The third book kind of fell down a bit for us. There's a narrative perspective change which occurs, because you're following Kate's perspective exclusively in the first two novels, and then it changes slightly in the third book, where you get hers and another character's perspective. And while that felt kind of novel at first, then it started to feel a bit awkward, and so that didn't work as well for us. And then there's an epilogue in this novel, which I think Edna O'Brien wrote only many years later, when all three of these novels were published together as a single volume. And so she wrote this new afterword, which is really like a novella in it, because I think it's like 100 or so pages long, continuing on and showing the conclusion of these women's story. And it gets so heartbreaking and horrible at the end of just like literally what happens. And so it made it difficult to read towards the end. And Sarah made a really good point, I think, in that it's not so much the way that things turn out, because like for a lot of people, as we get older in our lives, our options narrow, and there's an accumulation of tragic things that occur, that we might have made some bad decisions which we regret, and there's sort of a buildup of that over time. So it's not so much that this occurs in the third novel and in the epilogue, but the way she structured it and portrayed it, and the voice that she told it in, just didn't really seem to do justice to it. But I'd really like to know more about why Edna O'Brien made these choices in the third book and the epilogue, and why she chose to conclude it in this way and tell it in this way. I'd be really interested to find that out. But overall, a really fantastic reading experience. I can't believe I took so long to read these these Irish classics, these modern Irish classics now, and I think they are really really deserve that place. I mean, when Edna O'Brien wrote them, it's difficult to remember now, like how revolutionary some of the subjects she was writing about, of these women that were sort of taking charge of their own lives and talking about sex and having sexual relations in a very frank and open way, how that was so objectionable at the time. And actually copies of the novel were burnt when it was first published, and there were objections made by politicians and religious leaders in the country at the time. So it was quite a big scandal. And though lots of the things that occur in this now could be seen as like familiar Irish tropes, they they were really revolutionary at the time. And so it's difficult to remember that as a reader, now in the present, being so familiar with these things and going back on it. But I think it is important to recall that of the reception of the book when it first came out. I also read the novel Appliance by J.O. Morgan, which was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction this year, although Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These ultimately went to winning that prize. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see if it wins the Booker as well. But this was really interesting novel, very different kind of novel from what I'm used to reading. It's in some ways kind of sci-fi, but also kind of a satire of our present times and use of technology over time. And I think there's such a strong conception of how technology is such a marker of advancement in our society, and we take it almost as given that it's helping society to progress forward. But I think this asks really interesting questions of maybe some so-called advances aren't really for the betterment as a whole in society. I mean, there are certainly very many things, advancements, and the way that we live now is so much more better and comfortable than obviously 100 years ago. But I think there are a number of things that you can question, like, are these developments really for the betterment and advancement of society? And so it's kind of like a short story collection as you follow these accounts of a number of different individuals over a long period of time as this new technology is being developed, whereby items and eventually people can be instantly transported to a very distant location and sort of instantly transported. And or are they actually being transported? Are the physical makeup of these objects and individuals being kind of broken down and destroyed and then recreated through this technological development in another place entirely? And that makes a whole interesting question to do with individuality and the uniqueness of people and objects, but which is explored through the different stories of these different characters. And they're usually characters that are just kind of have this peripheral interaction with this technology, often quite a combative relationship with this new technology. Some of them really actively rebel against it. Others sort of utilize it, but in a quite like suspicious or uncertain way. And or some of their lives are kind of completely taken over by it in different ways. And so how it follows their different stories over a period of time to arrive at this really interesting place at the end of the novel, I think was really well done. And I really enjoyed this. Though there was one section like towards the beginning of the book which shows quite a horrific instance of rape occurring, and I felt really uncertain about the way that was handled. I think the author was trying to make a particular point about that, but just the way that was portrayed, I felt a bit uncertain about. But the rest of the novel, I was totally into, and there is, with each new chapter, you have to sort of reorientate yourself to this new situation and these new characters. But I think he handled that quite well, and that most often I was able to instantly like identify what was occurring and how the technology was the characters were interacting with it and how it was affecting their lives, and so to follow that was really interesting. And I thought this was a very good book. I'm glad that the prize highlighted it for me. And I also read the novel The Arena of the Unwell by Liam Konemann, which I read this as a book group, this book group I've been a part of for the past several months, and we all got together and discussed it. And I was a bit worried at first, because when we started talking about it, most people in the group seemed quite positive and really liked this book. But then one member really raised his objections to it, and I was so glad about that, because I had a lot of objections and issues with this book as well, that follows a young man that's kind of in the indie music scene, that he really cares about indie music. There's this particular band that he follows that he absolutely loves, and they have a new album coming out, and there's a kind of parallel story of how this band is developing alongside following his life as he works in a record shop. And he has a good friend who he kind of lives with and relies upon, but he's also very frustrated and depressed and has a lot of emotional issues and isn't able to progress in his life, or find a purpose or find a relationship. A lot in this book is about his struggles as a gay man that doesn't fit into the sort of stereotypical gay scene. Like, he doesn't go to gay bars, he doesn't use like hookup apps, or he doesn't traditionally, he does at one point in the book. And so how he tries to find his place in a community with having all of these issues, and that's a very like good and sympathetic journey to follow. But the way that the novel is structured, in that he starts this relationship with a man that he's initially friends with, but this man also lives with this other man, and they have a whole complicated relationship, and how he gets entangled in this kind of love triangle. And it's almost like the onus falls upon these two men that he has a relationship with, rather than him sort of taking charge of his own life. And it's almost like the story was saying, like, well, it's their fault that he has all these problems in his life, or that he's not able to progress forward, even though I don't think it's totally saying that. I mean, I think it is showing that, he has faults with his character, but it seems like all of his issues are sort of being projected outward, and that he's this kind of victim, and I didn't really see him in that way. I think it is, I mean, he's a young man. He's struggling to find out where he fits in the world, and that is very sympathetic. A lot of young men go through that and have those issues, but the way that plays out in the story, I just didn't feel all that much sympathy for him. I felt like he was holding himself back quite a lot, and missing out on opportunities, and not allowing himself to be open to have the connections and relationships with individuals, especially people like his friend and his father, who are trying to help him, but he really rebuffs that and blocks people out, and obviously that's a real and serious issue as well. But just the way that the novel handled that, I found really frustrating and not very satisfying. And also there are issues to do with self-harm in this book, which is brought up very abruptly and very quickly, and then sort of dropped again. And I feel like if you're going to introduce that subject matter into a novel, it needs to be handled a bit more sensitively, and also integrated more into the overall narrative, not just sort of thrown in there. And unfortunately it did feel that way to me. And even though, that's a very serious issue that I think ought to be written about and ought to be discussed, but just the way this particular novel handles that, I didn't think was done very well. So this wasn't a very successful read for me, and I'm glad somebody else in my book group felt the same way as me, that it's like not just me that felt this way. I'm glad it was written, and that stories of different sorts of gay individuals are being written about, but this just didn't quite work for me. And then finally, I also read Labona by Ottessa Moshfegh, which again, I'm only going to talk about briefly because I made a whole other video about this. And there's lots of shocking, lots of gruesome content in this. And I think if you're a reader that is sensitive to those things, then you'd probably want to avoid this, because there's lots of bitterness in this novel as well. It has a very bleak worldview to it, which, even if you don't have such an issue with reading about violence and lots of horrible, disgusting acts. Like that kind of bleak worldview is quite difficult to read about in a lot of ways, I think, for some people. So if you have issues with that, this probably wouldn't be a book for you. But like I talked about in my video, I think there's a kind of catharsis in reading a story like this, that we can get so frustrated with the complacency of people around us, and how she puts that into this historical context of this, well, imagined historical context of this kind of feudal community, and this really atrocious leader of the community who is, you can only see him as comical because he is so greedy and disgusting and selfish and tyrannical, that he is like such a ridiculous comical character, but also obviously the things that he does and his actions are absolutely atrocious and horrible, and following that through the conflicted perspective of this very naive boy that gets unexpectedly drawn close to this this leader in this community that is actively oppressing and putting the villagers through lots of horrible things. How it follows that, but also the story of his father and his father's weird sadistic kind of or at least like there's a lot of self-harm for him as he flagellates himself in this kind of religious practice of his, and but how he's a very conflicted individual in this, and also this other really interesting character on the fringes of society that acts as a nursemaid to much of the villagers, and who's kind of branded a witch but is also seen as a kind of healer or somebody that holds the community together through these very desperate periods. How it follows those different characters is really interesting, and so like I was really engaged with the experience of reading this novel. I don't know if I would say I enjoyed it, but I was really engaged by it and gripped by it as I was reading it. Though as the weeks are starting to go by, it's kind of drifting to the back of my mind, and I don't think this novel is going to make a very long lasting impression on me, but I was very engaged by it. So I'll be interested to hear from more people that have read this and your thoughts about this, or if you've decided not to read it, and your feelings about that. So those are all the books I read this month. Quite a lot. A good reading month. I just had time to really sit down and read and enjoy and get a lot out of these different books. So glad I read that. A good start to reading the Booker Prize season. I don't feel any of this tremendous rush to like read all the books immediately, but I'm just going to enjoy reading them over the course of the prize season, and discovering them as I go, and seeing if that shifts my opinion of who might win this year. But thanks for listening to my thoughts about these. I've put links below to some more full reviews if you want to know more of my thoughts about any of these books. But I'd love to know if you've read any of these or other things that you've read over the past month. Let me know about some of the best or worst things that you've read recently. And I'm gonna go have lunch now. Sorry, the sun keeps going in and out, so I'm aware that the color of my face keeps changing as the light comes in and out. But hope you're doing well and reading good things. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.